The buzz of machinery was a lullaby for Cade Ridgel, an orchestra of clattering gears and whirring drills, the symphony of a world underground. Mars' surface was a desolate hellscape, a rusty ball where dreams went to die. But below, well, it had its own kind of charm, if you squinted just right. Cade ducked under a low-hanging pipe, its steam hissing like an angry cat. This was home, or as close as you got when your address was a number and a corridor. He kicked a stray wrench out of his path and it clattered down the metal walkway. "Hey, watch it!" shouted a voice to his left. Arlen Vex, self-proclaimed leader of this subterranean circus. He had charisma, sure, the kind of grit that kept you alive when everything else suggested you give up. "Relax, Vex." "Just clearing the runway," Cade replied, his voice dripping with feigned innocence. "You know how it is, safety first and all that." Arlen raised an eyebrow. "Safety? From you, I'd expect as much safety as a blindfolded monkey with a plasma cutter." "You wound me," Cade retorted, clutching his chest. "But I'm touched you think so highly of my skills." Their banter was interrupted by a sudden announcement echoing through the corridor. The voice, flat and mechanical, seemed almost bored with its own existence. "Attention, all personnel. The Zorathian overseers have decreed a ban on sarcasm, effective immediately. Non-compliance will be met with punitive measures." The announcement hung in the air like a bad smell. Arlen and Cade exchanged glances, a silent conversation that spoke volumes. "Well, shit," Cade finally said, breaking the silence. "There goes my entire personality." Arlen smirked, but there was tension behind his eyes. "These Zorathians really know how to kill a party, don't they?" "Ban sarcasm. That's like banning breathing for humans," Cade muttered, scratching at the stubble on his chin. "Not that the air's great down here anyway." They wandered down the corridor, the metal floor clanging underfoot, each step echoing the sentiment of 1,000 disgruntled colonists. It was one thing to live under an alien regime, but to strip away the very essence of what it meant to be human. That was a new low. "I guess we'll have to resort to interpretive dance to express our disdain," Arlen suggested, chuckling dryly. "Wonder how the Zorathians feel about jazz hands." Cade laughed, a short bark of amusement. "I'm sure they'll find a way to ban that too. Can't of us out here throwing hands all willy-nilly." The colony was bustling despite the drab announcement. People brushed past, their expressions a mix of annoyance and resignation, a typical Tuesday in the underground. Some nodded toward Arlen, a silent acknowledgement of his makeshift authority. "How long do you think we can ignore this one?" Cade asked as they reached a junction. "Until our overseers decide an unscheduled visit is necessary," Arlen replied, "which could be tomorrow or next year." The Zorathians aren't exactly known for their transparency or their sense of humor. No kidding. They're as funny as a funeral on a rainy day. They stopped outside a large door marked Engineering Bay, Cade's domain. Inside, it was a chaotic haven of tools, half-built contraptions, and other assorted junk. To anyone else, it looked like a mechanical disaster waiting to happen. To Cade, it was art. "Speaking of transparency, you got any tricks up your sleeve to deal with this latest decree?" Arlen asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I don't know, maybe invent a sarcasm detector and set it to self-destruct," Cade suggested, a grin playing on his lips. "That's the spirit," Arlen said, shaking his head. "But seriously, we need to tread carefully. The last thing we want is a full-scale crackdown." Yeah, I get it. Well, if I come up with anything that won't get us vaporized, you'll be the first to know." Arlen nodded and pushed off the doorframe, continuing down the corridor. "Just remember, Cade, there's a fine line between genius and lunacy, and you're dancing dangerously close to it." Cade saluted with a mock flourish. "Lunacy is just misunderstood genius, my friend." Left alone in his workshop, Cade surveyed the mess with a critical eye. The ban on sarcasm was a joke, albeit a dangerous one, but he had to admit it was an interesting challenge. He flipped a switch and a series of lights flickered to life, illuminating his latest project, a drone made from spare parts and sheer determination. "Time to get creative," he mumbled to himself, reaching for a screwdriver. If the Zorathians think they can strip humanity of its humor, they've got another thing coming. The Iors passed with the kind of focused fury only an impending deadline could inspire. Tools clattered, metal clinked, and Cade's thoughts whirled like mad bees. The colony was a powder keg, and he couldn't shake the feeling they were all just waiting for the spark. He was elbow-deep in wires when the door creaked open. A familiar silhouette stood in the threshold. "Heard you were causing trouble again," Talia said, her voice laced with amusement. "Talia," Cade said, lifting his head and squinting against the harsh lights. "Come to join the madness." She stepped inside, shaking her head. "More like keep you from blowing us all to hell." "Always the pessimist," Cade replied, gesturing toward a cluttered workbench. "Pull up a stool, grab a wrench." Talia smirked, easing onto the offered seat. "So, how's our fight against cosmic oppression going?" "Oh, you know," Cade shrugged, tinkering with the drone. "Just another day, another attempt at not getting screwed by our alien overlords." "I heard about the sarcasm ban," Talia remarked, folding her arms. "Seems like they're trying to suck the fun out of everything." "Yeah, if it wasn't such a pain in the ass, it'd almost be impressive," Cade replied, twisting a bolt into place. "But hey, if sarcasm's out, maybe we can thrive on spite alone." Talia chuckled, a rare sound in the oppressive underground. "Spite's a strong motivator. Maybe it's time we gave the Zorathians a taste of their own medicine." Cade paused, looking up with a raised eyebrow. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "If you're thinking about building a sarcasm-powered weapon, then yes," Talia replied, her grin widening. "Because nothing says human spirit like weaponizing wit." "You're twisted," Cade said, grinning back. "But I like it." They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the hum of machinery and the occasional clatter of tools. The colony outside was a different world, a place of subdued chatter and worried glances. But here, amidst the chaos of schematics and spare parts, there was a sense of purpose. "You really think we can pull this off?" Talia asked after a while, her gaze fixed on the half-finished drone. "I think," Cade replied, tightening another bolt, "that if we don't try, we're as good as done." She nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. They were small cogs in a massive machine, but cogs had a way of jamming the works when you least expected it. "So what's next on the agenda of rebellion?" Talia inquired, leaning back. "Keep our heads down for now. But if opportunity knocks, we'll answer with a sledgehammer," Cade said, his eyes glinting with mischief. Their conversation was cut short by another announcement, the same droning voice that seemed to suck the life out of the very air. "All personnel to report for compliance checks. Failure to comply will result in immediate disciplinary action." "Well, that's not ominous at all," Talia said, standing up and dusting off her hands. "Guess we better play nice." "Yeah," Cade replied, though his mind was already racing. "Or at least pretend to." Together, they left the engineering bay, stepping back into the flow of the colony. People were already gathering, their movements sluggish, as if weighed down by invisible chains. The Zorathians were good at that, Cade thought, making you feel like you were drowning even when you were standing on solid ground. As they joined the crowd, Cade couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could keep up the charade, and what would happen when the facade finally cracked. "Hey," Talia nudged him, breaking his reverie. "Try not to look so grim. You'll scare the kids." Cade forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "Wouldn't want that," he said. "Gotta keep up appearances, right?" They reached the gathering point, a sprawling chamber where laughter was rare and smiles were rationed like air. The Zorathian enforcers stood at the edges, their presence a constant reminder of who really held the power. Tall, imposing figures with expressions carved from stone, they watched over the proceedings with an air of detached boredom. "Smile and wave, boys. Smile and wave," Cade whispered, earning a snort from Talia. The compliance checks were routine, a process designed to remind everyone of their place. But today, something felt different. There was a crackle in the air, a tension that hummed just beneath the surface. Cade watched as Arlen stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice carrying a calm authority that belied the chaos beneath. "We all know the rules," Arlen began, his tone even. "Let's get through this quickly and quietly." The crowd murmured in response, a low rumble of discontent that was quickly silenced by a sharp glance from the enforcers. Cade met Talia's eyes, a silent communication passing between them. They'd get through this somehow. But the question remained, how long could they play this game before someone changed the rules entirely? As the compliance checks continued, Cade felt the weight of the Zorathians' gaze on his back, like a specter that refused to be shaken off. Mars might have been home, but it was a home built on shifting sands. And Cade couldn't help but wonder when the ground beneath them would finally give way. The compliance checks were about as much fun as watching paint dry, with the added bonus of grim-faced Zorathian enforcers who looked like they'd stab you as soon as look at you. Cade, Talia, and the rest of the colonists lined up like schoolchildren awaiting a particularly unpleasant exam. "You think they want us to strip next?" Talia whispered, her voice barely audible over the low drone of the proceedings. Cade smirked, his eyes darting toward the nearest enforcer whose expression was a masterpiece of apathy. "Nah, they're more likely to ask for a blood sample, or maybe a soul," Talia chuckled. "Good thing I traded mine for a decent meal years ago." As the lines shuffled forward with all the joy of a funeral procession, Cade's mind wandered. Compliance checks weren't just a nuisance. They were a reminder of the iron grip the Zorathians had on their lives. And now, with the sarcasm ban, it felt like they were trying to squeeze out the last drops of humanity they could muster. "Next," barked a Zorathian, his voice as pleasant as nails on a chalkboard. Cade stepped forward, forcing his face into a semblance of cooperation. The enforcer scanned him with a device that hummed ominously, a mix between a metal detector and a cattle prod. Cade held his breath, resisting the urge to offer a snarky comment about whether it could detect personality too. "Move along," the enforcer said, waving him forward like he was a particularly unimpressive meat sack. Cade rejoined Talia, who was waiting by the exit with a look that could curdle milk. "Well, that was a hoot," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "One of these days they'll invent a machine that detects sarcasm," she replied, her grin as sharp as a broken bottle. "That's when we'll really be in trouble," Cade agreed, casting a quick glance around. Arlen was waiting, nodding toward an alcove where they could talk without prying eyes or ears. The small group of them gathered, a ragtag band of rebels without a plan. Besides Cade and Talia, there were Grax and Jinya, both trustworthy and just disillusioned enough to take a risk. Arlen stood at the center, the reluctant leader of their little conspiracy. "This ban is just the start," Arlen began, keeping his voice low and urgent. "Next, they'll be telling us how to breathe. We need to push back before we're all speaking Zorathian and eating whatever passes for their idea of food." Jinya rolled her eyes. "Does that mean we finally get rid of those protein bricks they call lunch? Because that's the only upside I'm seeing." "If you call that an upside, you've officially lost your mind," Grax said, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "But seriously, what's the plan?" "Sarcasm is about all we've got left," Cade nodded. "Right. Without it, we might as well be drones ourselves. We need to start small, subtle acts of defiance. Something to remind everyone we're still human. Like what?" Talia asked, eyebrows raised. "Steal their toilet paper. Write rude messages in the sand," Cade chuckled. "Tempting, but we need to be smart. We start by creating a network. A way to communicate without them noticing. And we do it all without a single sarcastic remark." Arlen nodded, his expression hardening. "We need eyes and ears everywhere. People who can move unnoticed, pass messages, keep an eye on those surveillance drones. They're more than just inconvenience. They're the overseer's way of tightening the noose." The group fell silent, each considering the implications. It wasn't just sarcasm on the line. It was the essence of their identity being chipped away bit by bit. Jinya broke the silence. "And if they catch us, then we get creative," Cade replied. "Mars is full of hiding spots. We can make their lives as difficult as they're making ours." Besides, Arlen added, his grin wolfish, "nobody likes a teacher's pet. If we're going down, we might as well take them with us, Grax snorted. Spoken like a true Martian. With their resolve steeled, the group dispersed, each member slipping back into the ebb and flow of the colony. They were small, insignificant specks in a vast machine, but even a speck could become an irritant, an itch that refused to go away. The drones hovered in the corridors, silent sentinels that reminded everyone of the ever-watchful eye of their overseers. Cade wondered if they'd been programmed to detect more than sarcasm, dissidence perhaps, or hope. His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. Cade. He turned to find Arlen again, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "We need to talk." Privately. Cade nodded, following Arlen to a secluded corner away from the prying eyes of drones. The hum of machinery provided a comforting white noise, a barrier against eavesdroppers. "What's up?" Cade asked, crossing his arms. "I've been thinking," Arlen said, rubbing his chin. "The Zorathians are pushing harder than ever. If we don't act soon, we might not get another chance." "Act how?" Cade asked, intrigued despite himself. "You got a plan that doesn't end with us getting shipped off to the mines," Arlen smirked. "Yeah. We start with those drones. They're key to the Zorathians' control. If we can disrupt their surveillance, we gain some breathing room. You want to take out their eyes?" Cade asked, his interest piqued. "Not just take them out," Arlen replied, eyes gleaming. "Reprogram them, turn them against their masters. Imagine the chaos." Cade's mind raced. The idea was bold, reckless, exactly his kind of madness. "You think we can pull it off with your skills and a little luck?" "Yeah," Arlen said, clapping Cade on the shoulder. "We're not just fighting for sarcasm. We're fighting for our future." "I'll see what I can do," Cade said, already mentally cataloging the tools and resources he'd need. "But if this goes sideways, I hope you've got an escape plan." "If it goes sideways, we'll be too busy laughing to worry," Arlen said with a grin. Cade returned to his workshop, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. Reprogramming the drones would be a monumental task, but if they succeeded, it would be the first real blow against the Zorathians. He set to work, the chaos of his workshop a comfort as he tinkered with circuits and algorithms. Each drone had to be disabled, its programming overwritten with a new directive. One that would turn them from watchdogs into wildcards. The Ior slipped by in a blur of wires and code, his determination fueled by the prospect of rebellion. Talia joined him, her presence a steadying influence amidst the frenzy. "You really going to do this?" she asked, her tone a mix of awe and disbelief. "Damn right," Cade replied, not looking up from his work. "It's about time the Zorathians got a taste of their own tech." Talia studied him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Well, if anyone can pull it off, it's you. Just try not to blow us up in the process." "No promises," Cade replied, his mind already several steps ahead. "But if I do, at least it'll give them something to talk about." She laughed, the sound a rare burst of joy in the oppressive underground. "You're insane, you know that, yeah, but insanity's just another word for creativity," Cade said, grinning. The drone project consumed him, each success a step closer to liberation. But the risk was high, and the Zorathians wouldn't sit idly by. If they caught wind of their plans, the consequences would be dire. As Cade worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out. The Zorathians' grip tightened every day, and the colony was a pressure cooker ready to explode. But if they could pull this off, if they could reprogram the drones, it might just be the spark they needed. The first step toward reclaiming their freedom. With Talia at his side, Cade pushed forward, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and possibilities. The Zorathians may have banned sarcasm, but they couldn't ban resistance. And as long as they had that, they had hope. The drones were coming online, their new directives ready to be unleashed. It was a gamble, a long shot in 1,000. But in a world where survival meant playing the odds, it was a chance they had to take. Cade stepped back, surveying the fruits of their labor with a mix of pride and trepidation. "Time to see if we're geniuses or just crazy," he said, glancing at Talia. Her expression mirrored his, a blend of anticipation and fear. "Either way, it'll be one hell of a show." Together, They prepared to launch their rebellion, the first salvo in a war they couldn't afford to lose. The Zorathians wanted compliance, but they were about to get chaos. And if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was making a mess of things. If there was one thing Mars did best, it was burying its residents in bad news. Like the dense red dust that found its way into every crevice and corner, the Zorathians' oppressive reach was inescapable. Hot on the heels of their sarcasm ban came another delightful decree from their alien landlords, this time targeting the one place humans thought might be safe: their minds. "You've got to be kidding me," Cade groaned, staring at the new poster plastered across the colony's main corridor. It proclaimed, boldly, arrogantly, that thought-monitoring devices would now be deployed to ensure compliance with Zorathian ideals. "Guess they're not big on privacy," Talia quipped, scanning the announcement with disbelief. "What's next?" "Banning free will. That's probably on the agenda for next week," Cade replied, rubbing his temples. "I'd suggest moving to a different planet, but I hear the real estate market's a little tight." Arlen joined them, his face set in grim determination. "We can't let this stand. If they start monitoring our thoughts, it's game over. It's bad enough they've stomped out sarcasm. Yeah, it's a real tragedy," Cade snorted. "Humanity's greatest weapon reduced to a whisper, or a whimper," Talia added. "So what's the plan?" Fearless leader Arlen's eyes glinted with a spark of defiance. "We improvise." "Cade, I'm guessing you've got some trick up your sleeve." "Maybe," Cade said, already spinning ideas in his mind like a gambler lining up another bad bet. "But it'll take resources we don't exactly have lying around, of course," Talia said dryly, "because nothing in life is ever simple or fair, especially not on Mars." Cade agreed. "But who needs fair when you've got stubbornness and a death wish? Best combo out there," Talia said, a sardonic smile playing on her lips. With that, Cade retreated to his cluttered workshop once more. The place was a chaos of spare parts, half-finished projects, and enough dust to start its own colony. But amidst the disorder, he could think, could plot. If he was going to beat Zorathian thought monitors, he'd need something unconventional. His mind buzzed with half-formed plans, each wilder than the last. He finally settled on a device, a thought disruptor. It would need to send out bursts of random signals to confuse the monitors, essentially turning their brains into static channels. Problem was, he needed materials that the colony didn't possess, unless they started deconstructing essential life support systems. Not ideal, unless they fancied a collective suffocation. Talia joined him again, leaning against a workbench. "Any luck, sort of," Cade replied, scrubbing a hand through his hair. "If by luck you mean an idea I can't actually build, then yeah, tons. Sounds promising," she said, sarcasm thick in her voice. "But seriously, what do we need? Metallic wiring, rare earth magnets, stuff you'd find in old tech. But the Zorathians confiscated all that ages ago. So we improvise," Talia said with a shrug. "It's what we're best at, right?" Cade sighed, nodding. "Yeah, but unless someone's got a secret stash of contraband tech, we're screwed." Grax and Jinya entered, interrupting the brainstorming session with their usual blend of skepticism and realism. "Heard you're trying to pull off a miracle," Grax said, arms crossed in his typical pose of doubt. "More like a Hail Mary," Cade replied. "Got any old Earth gadgets lying around?" "Not unless you count this," Jinya said, tossing a rusted Mars rover wheel into the room with a clang. "Can you make it work?" Cade stared at the wheel and then at Jinya, his expression somewhere between bemused and incredulous. "Sure, I'll just whip up a new iPhone out of it." "Great," Grax said, without missing a beat. "I'd love to check my non-existent social media. Seriously though," Cade said, sobering. "We need parts or this plan's dead in the water." "Water's a luxury item," Jinya remarked, "but I get your point. Maybe we can scavenge some." "Scavenge?" Grax said, raising an eyebrow. "You're talking about sneaking into Zorathian storage, right?" "It's not sneaking if they don't see you," Talia said, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Right. It's borrowing," Cade added. "And I'm all for borrowing permanently." With their next mission clear, the group dispersed, each pondering how best to pull off a heist against a technologically superior alien race. A tall order, but then again, humans had a knack for ambition that bordered on suicidal. The next day, under the guise of routine maintenance, Cade and Talia slipped through the colony's labyrinthine corridors, their destination a seldom-used access tunnel that led directly to the Zorathian storage facility. The Zorathians, in their infinite arrogance, assumed their security measures were impregnable. This was good. It meant they hadn't accounted for human ingenuity or stupidity, depending on one's perspective. "Think this'll work?" Talia asked, her voice a whisper in the narrow passage. "Depends what you mean by work," Cade replied. "If you mean get us killed, then yes, absolutely. That's comforting." They reached the access point, a ventilation shaft just large enough for a determined, or desperate, human to squeeze through. Cade pried it open, the metal protesting with a screech that sliced through the tension like a guillotine. "I'll go first," he said, hoisting himself into the shaft. "If it collapses, I've always wanted to die in a cramped metal tube." "Hey, it's on my bucket list too," Talia joked, following him. The crawl through the ventilation shaft was an exercise in testing one's patience. Cade could feel the dust invading his lungs, as though Mars was determined to become part of him. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged above the storage facility, a cavernous space filled with crates and forgotten tech. "Jackpot," Cade murmured, his eyes scanning for anything useful. "Let's make it quick," Talia whispered, and they dropped silently onto the floor below. The facility was a treasure trove of outdated Earth tech, relics from a time before humanity realized Mars was the universe's worst fixer-upper. The Zorathians had collected it all, perhaps out of curiosity, or as a reminder of human inefficiency. Cade and Talia set to work, scavenging anything that might be useful: copper wiring, pieces of old comm devices, circuit boards. It was a start, but it wouldn't be enough. "We need those magnets," Cade said, eyeing a crate marked high-voltage equipment. If they were lucky, it might contain what they needed. "I'll cover you," Talia said, her gaze darting around the room for signs of movement. Cade approached the crate, working quickly to pry it open. Come on," he muttered, finally wrenching the lid free. Inside, he found a tangled mess of electrical components, including the precious magnets. "Got him," he said, tucking them into his satchel. "Let's get out of here before they realize they've been robbed blind." They scrambled back into the ventilation shaft, crawling toward the sanctuary of the colony's main corridors. They moved with the urgency of fugitives, hearts pounding in their chests like twin drumbeats orchestrating their own escape. Emerging once more into the relative safety of the corridors, Cade took a deep breath, his lungs grateful for the recycled air that didn't taste like rust and failure. "Think they'll notice?" Talia asked, as they blended into the ebb and flow of colony life. "Only if they start counting," Cade replied. "And from what I hear, Zorathians aren't big on arithmetic." With their haul secured, they returned to Cade's workshop, where Arlen, Grax, and Jinya waited, each eager to hear the outcome of their little adventure. "Did you get it?" Arlen asked, his expression a mix of hope and skepticism. "More or less," Cade replied, dumping the contents of his satchel onto the workbench. "Now comes the fun part." "Fun," he says, Jinya noted, watching as Cade began piecing together the components. "I swear you've got a different definition of fun than the rest of us." "Maybe," Cade said with a grin. "But if this works, we'll have the last laugh. Assuming we still have lungs to laugh with," Grax added, ever the pessimist. They watched as Cade worked, his fingers a blur over the mismatched parts. The device began to take shape, an amalgam of human ingenuity and desperation. "It's a prototype," he said, holding it up to the light. "But it should scramble their thought monitors enough to give us a fighting chance." Arlen nodded, his expression serious. "We're counting on you, Cade. If this doesn't work, let's not dwell on the doesn't work part," Cade interrupted. "We're in the business of miracles, not maybes." "Here's hoping you're right," Talia said, her voice a mixture of confidence and trepidation. With the device ready, they prepared to test it, knowing that failure wasn't just a setback, it was a death sentence. The Zorathians had made their intentions clear. Humans were expendable, replaceable as the very oxygen they breathed. But if Cade had his way, they'd soon learn that humanity wasn't so easy to silence. They'd fought tooth and nail to make Mars home, and they'd fight even harder to keep it theirs. As the group gathered to watch the device's initial test, the tension was palpable. Rarely did hope feel so heavy, but on Mars, even optimism carried weight. "Ready?" Arlen asked, his voice low. "Ready as I'll ever be," Cade said, activating the device. It hummed to life with a low, comforting whir, casting a faint, flickering light. They waited, breaths held, as the seconds dragged into eternity. The device emitted an oscillating tone designed to confuse the thought monitors without alerting the Zorathians to their presence. "Is it working?" Grax asked, skeptical as ever. Cade shrugged, his eyes on the device. "If we're not dead by morning, I'd say yeah." Comforting, Jinya muttered. The night passed without incident, a small victory in the ongoing war. But Cade knew their reprieve was temporary. The thought disruptor was a band-aid on a gaping wound, and it was only a matter of time before the Zorathians caught on. Yet for the first time, as they prepared to face another day under the watchful eyes of their alien overlords, Cade felt a flicker of hope. Because deep down, beneath the dust and despair, humanity had always thrived on defying the odds. And as long as they drew breath, as long as they refused to be cowed, the Zorathians would never truly win. Mars, with its unforgiving landscape and relentless challenges, had taught them resilience. And in the end, that resilience might just be their salvation. Cade stared at the motley crew assembled in his workshop. They looked like the cast of a low-budget sci-fi flick, but they were all he had. Arlen, the self-proclaimed leader who acted like he had a plan. Talia, whose sarcasm was as sharp as a Zorathian blade. Grax, the eternal pessimist. And Jinya, who found humor in hopelessness. Together, they were Mars' least likely heroes. The thought disruptor hummed quietly on the workbench, a Frankenstein monster of wires and old tech. It was supposed to be their answer to the Zorathians' mind-reading tyranny, but Cade couldn't shake the feeling that it might also be their ticket to an early funeral. "All right, let's see if this contraption works outside the cozy confines of my workshop," Cade said, trying to sound confident. He wasn't fooling anyone, least of all himself. "You mean let's see if it blows up in our faces," Grax replied, arms crossed like a permanent shield against optimism. "Exactly," Cade said. "Nothing like a bit of explosive excitement to start the day." Jinya chuckled. "Well, if we're going to go out, might as well do it with a bang." The plan was simple. Use the disruptor during a compliance check and see if it threw off the Zorathians' thought monitors. Of course, simple in their line of work was code for incredibly dangerous and probably stupid. As they made their way to the compliance check area, the air was thick with tension. The corridors of their underground haven were alive with the buzz of colonists, all trying to avoid the Zorathian enforcers, who were as welcome as a rash in a spacesuit. "Remember," Arlen said in his best leaderly tone, "we're just going for a stroll. Nothing suspicious about a group of people walking with purpose." "Sure," Talia replied, smirking. "Nothing says innocent like trying not to look guilty." They arrived at the compliance check with a casualness that was anything but. The Zorathian enforcers were already there, grim-faced and menacing. They looked like lizards stuffed into ill-fitting uniforms, their eyes scanning for any hint of non-compliance. Cade felt the disruptor's weight in his pocket, a reassuring presence he hoped would work as advertised. He glanced at Talia, who gave him a slight nod. It was showtime. As they joined the line of colonists, pretending to be just another group of oppressed humans, Cade's heart pounded like a war drum. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the device's cold metal exterior. He flicked the switch, praying it wouldn't seize this moment to short-circuit or spontaneously combust. The disruptor emitted a low-frequency hum, barely perceptible over the ambient noise of the colony. Cade watched as the Zorathian enforcers moved along the line, their scanning devices probing for forbidden thoughts like a nosy neighbor peering over the fence. Then something unexpected happened. One of the Zorathian enforcers, an alien with scales the color of a bad bruise, paused, looking confused. It was almost comical, like watching a cat trying to understand a cucumber. The disruptor was working. "It's working," Talia whispered, echoing Cade's thoughts. "Don't celebrate yet," Cade replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Let's see if we can make it through without becoming alien decor." As the enforcers continued their checks, Cade felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they'd actually pull this off. Maybe they'd finally have something to celebrate other than surviving another day on this rusty dust ball. But of course, nothing was ever that simple. Just as they were about to pass through unscathed, one of the enforcers, a particularly unpleasant lizard with anger management issues, stopped and sniffed the air like he'd caught wind of something foul. "You," the enforcer barked, pointing a clawed finger at Cade. "Step out of line." "Great," Cade muttered. "Just what I needed." "An alien with a vendetta." "Calm down," Arlen said, though his voice was tense. "We'll handle this." Cade stepped out of line, the disruptor still humming in his pocket. The enforcer approached, his scanning device whirring ominously. Suddenly, one of the other enforcers, a younger, less grumpy-looking Zorathian, stepped forward. "Let him through, Blark," he said, with what passed for authority among their kind. Blark, the first enforcer, glared at his colleague. "Why should I? There's something off about him." "Because I said so," the younger one replied, voice firm. Cade watched this exchange with suspicion. Zorathians weren't exactly known for their camaraderie or flexibility. This was something new. Blark grumbled but stepped back, allowing Cade to rejoin the line. As they moved away from the compliance check, Cade felt the urge to look back at the young enforcer. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw a flicker of something familiar. "Did that just happen?" Jinya asked, incredulous. "Must be my lucky day," Cade replied, though he didn't believe in luck any more than he believed in the Tooth Fairy. "Or maybe you've got a guardian alien," Talia suggested, her tone mocking. "Just what I needed. An interstellar babysitter," Cade said, shaking his head. But as they returned to the safety of the colony's bowels, he couldn't shake the feeling that the young enforcer's intervention was more than mere happenstance. Something was off, and Cade was determined to find out what it was. Back in the workshop, they gathered to debrief, the disruptor finally silent but the tension still palpable. "So we pulled it off. Sort of," Grax said, the corners of his mouth twitching in what might have been an attempt at a smile. "Yeah, if by pulled it off you mean didn't get arrested immediately," Talia quipped. Arlen leaned against a workbench, arms crossed. "We need to figure out what happened back there." "Why did that enforcer help you, Cade?" "Beats me," Cade replied, though his mind was racing. "But it's worth investigating." "How do you plan to do that?" Jinya asked. "Ask him out for coffee." "Something like that," Cade said, a plan forming in his mind. The next day, Cade found himself loitering near the compliance check area, trying to look inconspicuous while waiting for an alien he barely knew. It was the kind of plan that had more holes than Martian cheese. Finally, the young Zorathian enforcer appeared, moving with the relaxed gait of someone not entirely sold on the job they were doing. Cade approached him cautiously. "Hey," Cade said, trying not to sound too desperate or too sane. The enforcer looked at him, eyes narrowing. "What do you want, human?" "To thank you," Cade replied. "For yesterday." "You didn't have to step in." The enforcer shrugged, his scales catching the dim light. "Blark's an ass. Someone had to." "Still," Cade persisted. "Why did you?" The enforcer hesitated, glancing around as if ensuring they weren't being watched. "Let's just say not all of us are thrilled about the way things are run around here." "Really?" Cade said, feigning ignorance. "And here I thought you all loved stomping on our freedom." The enforcer smirked, a surprisingly human gesture. "Not all of us. My name's Xylox, by the way." Cade replied, extending a hand, unsure if the gesture would translate. Xylox looked at the hand, then shook it awkwardly. "You're treading on dangerous ground, Cade," he said, "but I might be able to help." If you're interested. Cade nodded, a cautious optimism bubbling beneath his cynicism. I'm listening. Xylox leaned in, his voice low. Meet me at the old mining tunnels tomorrow, midnight, and bring your friends. With that, Xylox turned and walked away, leaving Cade with more questions than answers. Cade returned to the workshop where his crew waited, eager for news. Well, Arlen asked, impatience etched into his features. Cade relayed the conversation, watching as disbelief turned to interest among his friends. So we've got an ally, Jinya said, disbelief mingling with hope. Or a trap, Grax countered, ever the cynic. Only one way to find out, Talia said, her eyes bright with mischief. I'm all for midnight rendezvous. Especially if it involves rebels and aliens. Yeah, nothing could possibly go wrong, Cade replied, rolling his eyes. But what else are we going to do? Sit around and wait for our thoughts to be monitored into submission, Arlen nodded. Then it's settled. We meet Xylox. As the group prepared for their clandestine meeting, Cade couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at a precipice. One misstep and they could fall into oblivion. But if they played their cards right, they might just tip the scales in their favor. The next night, they made their way to the abandoned mining tunnels, a labyrinthine warren of darkness and forgotten dreams. It was the kind of place where shadows had shadows and the air smelled like ancient regrets. Cozy, Talia remarked, her voice echoing off the walls. Yeah, if you're into claustrophobic nightmarescapes, Cade replied, adjusting his grip on the bag containing the disruptor. Better safe than Zorathian food. They found Xylox waiting, his silhouette a stark outline against the dim glow of their flashlights. He looked more alien in the shadows, but maybe that was fitting. You came, Xylox said, sounding almost surprised. Didn't have much else going on, Cade replied. What's this about? Xylox gestured for them to follow, leading them deeper into the tunnels. I've been looking for ways to fight back like you, but it's difficult when you're surrounded by people who think compliance is the only option. Compliance is just another word for surrender, Arlen said, his voice firm. Xylox nodded. Exactly. That's why I want to help. I know the Zorathian systems, their weak points. Together we might stand a chance. Why trust us? Jinya asked, still skeptical. Because I hate the oppression as much as you do, Xylox replied. And because sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. Great, Grax muttered. I love blind leaps into potential disaster. Cade glanced at his companions. This was it, the moment they chose whether to trust Xylox or retreat into the safety of inaction. We're in, Cade said finally, his voice steady. What's the plan? Xylox grinned, an expression that was both alien and oddly reassuring. We disrupt their systems, free the thought monitors, and end up on their most wanted list, Talia added, grinning like she'd just been handed a challenge. We've been on that list since the first sarcasm ban, Cade pointed out. With the alliance forged, they spent the next hours planning, ideas flying like sparks in the dark. Each plan was riskier than the last, but then, playing it safe had never been their style. As dawn approached, Cade felt an unfamiliar sensation. Hope. Maybe it was the dawn of something new, or maybe they were just fooling themselves. But as the first rays of Martian sunlight crept into the tunnels, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts, one thing was certain. They weren't going down without a fight. And with a sarcastic human, a rebellious alien, and a team that thrived on chaos, they just might have a fighting chance. The air in the colony was thick with more than just dust and recycled oxygen. The Zorathians had outdone themselves, tightening the screws until the entire place felt like a pressure cooker about to blow. Tension hung over the underground corridors like an executioner's axe, ready to drop at any moment. Cade found himself standing in the main corridor, trying to put on a brave face while everything felt like it was spiraling down the Martian drain. Arlen was gone, dragged away by the enforcers in a display of power that would make a dictator blush. It was a textbook example of Zorathian hospitality. Arrest first, ask questions never. Nice of them to take our leader, Talia said, leaning against a wall, arms crossed. Guess they didn't fancy the idea of him breathing free air. Cade grimaced. Probably thought he was setting a bad example, showing too much spine. Jinya snorted. Spine's a rarity these days. It's like finding a clean sock in a laundry pile, almost mythical. Grax, ever the optimist, added his 2 cents. We're screwed, that's what this is. Without Arlen, we're just a bunch of disorganized miners with delusions of grandeur. Thanks for the pep talk, Cade replied, voice dripping with sarcasm. Really gives me something to look forward to. He shouldered the burden of leadership with the grace of a bull in a zero-gravity china shop, but what choice did he have? If someone didn't step up, they'd all end up as Zorathian footnotes. The colony felt emptier, and not just because they'd lost a few more souls to Zorathian hospitality. The mood had shifted, a collective sinking feeling that made even the bravest rethink their life choices. Hope was as scarce as clean water, and twice as expensive. Cade called a meeting in the workshop, where the group gathered in a circle that felt more like a support group than a resistance. They looked like they'd been through hell, which was fitting since hell was now their permanent address. We need to figure out our next move, Cade said. Arlen's capture is a setback, but it's not the end. Grax raised an eyebrow. Sure feels like it. What are we gonna do, Cade? March up to the Zorathians and ask nicely for our freedom back. Or maybe bake them a cake with a file in it, Talia suggested. Though knowing the Zorathians, they'd probably eat the file and leave the cake. Jinya shook her head. We need more than sarcasm to get through this, even if it's all we've got left. Xylox is still on our side, Cade said, trying to sound like he believed it. We have a chance to disrupt their systems, free those who've been caught. Assuming we don't get caught ourselves, Grax said. Nothing like a little mass incarceration to liven up a dull day. Look, I know it's risky, Cade replied, his exasperation showing. But it's all we've got. We can't sit back and let them stomp us into submission. The group was silent, the weight of their situation pressing down like the Martian gravity they'd all learned to loathe. It was a grim reminder of the stakes they faced, freedom or extinction. Finally, Talia spoke up, her voice cutting through the gloom like a breath of fresh air. Let's do it. If we're gonna go down, might as well go down swinging. That got a few nods from the group, a glimmer of defiance lighting in their eyes. Because really, what was the alternative? A lifetime under Zorathian rule, where even their thoughts weren't their own. No thanks. Cade felt a flicker of hope as they hashed out the details of their plan, though he knew full well it could all go to hell in a handbasket at any moment. But hell, if they were already in the frying pan, might as well bring the fire. The next few days were an exercise in keeping their heads down while preparing to lift them up for a fight. Cade went over the disruptor with a fine-tooth comb, trying to make sure it wouldn't blow up in their faces when they needed it most. Got any new ideas on how to make this thing work without turning us into Martian toast? Jinya asked, peering over his shoulder. Not unless you count praying to the gods of technology, Cade replied, tightening a wire that looked like it might have come from a 21st century toaster. But since they've been notoriously uncooperative, I'm pretty much winging it. Winging it, the foundation of all successful plans, Jinya said with a wry smile. Cade made a few more adjustments, each one feeling like a gamble with odds that would make a casino laugh. But there was nothing for it. They'd chosen their path, and now they had to walk it, whether it led to victory or a Zorathian prison cell. The night of the plan's execution arrived, and Cade could feel the tension in the air, as thick and suffocating as a Zorathian's idea of a good time. They gathered in the tunnels, the shadows whispering secrets that only the truly desperate could hear. Anyone else feel like we're heading into something epically stupid? Grax said, adjusting his gear with the enthusiasm of a man walking to his execution. Every day of my life, Talia replied, but that's never stopped us before. True enough, Cade said, echoing her sentiment. Let's make sure this isn't the day it does. Xylox joined them at the designated spot, his presence a stark reminder that not all of their kind were enemies. He looked at Cade with an expression that was almost human. Ready? Xylox asked, his voice steady despite the risk they all faced. As ready as we'll ever be, Cade replied. Which is to say not at all, but let's do it anyway. They moved through the tunnels like ghosts, silent and determined, with Xylox leading the way. The plan was simple: get in, disrupt the thought monitors, and hope to hell they'd live to see another day. It was all going smoothly, which naturally meant something had to go wrong. As they neared the control center, a blaring alarm shattered the quiet, echoing off the walls like the laughter of a sadistic god. "Well, so much for the element of surprise," Talia said, her voice carrying a mix of humor and fatalism. "Guess they rolled out the red carpet," Cade replied, heart pounding in his chest. Nothing like uninvited guests. Xylox quickly accessed a terminal, his claws flying over the keys in a blur. "I'll hold them off as long as I can. You get to the mainframe." Cade nodded, leading the group toward their target with all the confidence of a man running headlong into a minefield. The corridor stretched out before them like a gauntlet, daring them to make it through unscathed. The control room was ahead, its door looming like the maw of a beast. They burst inside, finding the room bustling with Zorathian guards. Any hopes of a quiet takeover evaporated faster than water on the Martian surface. "Hey there, room for a few more," Jinya quipped as they charged in, disruptor at the ready. The ensuing chaos was a blur of motion and sound, a symphony of rebellion that played out in the key of desperation. Cade focused on activating the disruptor, his hands steady despite the turmoil all around. Come on," he muttered, praying to whatever gods might be listening. "Give us something here." The disruptor hummed to life, a low thrum that felt like victory and doom rolled into one. The Zorathians faltered, their thought monitors shorting out in a cascade of sparks and smoke. "Well, that was easier than expected," Grax said, looking genuinely surprised. "Don't jinx it," Talia retorted, eyes darting around for any sign of reinforcements. They made their retreat, the air filled with the scent of burnt electronics and the thrill of barely escaping with their lives. The disruptor had worked, at least for now, and they'd struck a blow against their oppressors. As they regrouped in the tunnels, Cade allowed himself a moment of triumph, a brief flicker of hope in the suffocating gloom. "Did we just win?" Jinya asked, disbelief coloring her voice. "Something like that," Cade replied, though he knew better than to count his blessings. "But this is just the beginning. We've rattled their cage and they're not going to take it lying down." Xylox rejoined them, looking as weary as a Zorathian could. "You've done well, but they'll come back stronger. You need to be ready." "We'll be ready," Cade said, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were poking a sleeping dragon with a very short stick. As they made their way back to the colony, Cade felt the weight of their victory tempered by the knowledge that the road ahead would only grow more treacherous. But for now, they had a reason to hope, and sometimes that was enough. And as they returned to the safety, however temporary, of their underground world, Cade couldn't help but smile at the defiance in his companion's eyes. They'd chosen to fight, and for better or worse, it was a choice they'd see through to the end. Because in a world where even hope was rationed, defiance was the one thing they had in abundance. Cade stared at the piece of jury-rigged tech in front of him, an unholy marriage between human ingenuity and Zorathian over-engineering. It looked like an art project gone wrong, all wires and circuit boards held together with more hope than solder. The plan was simple, meaning incredibly dangerous and probably stupid. As usual, use this makeshift communicator to send a message to Earth. "Well, it's either going to work or set us all on fire," Cade muttered, eyeing the device like it was a particularly venomous snake. "And given our luck, I'm betting on the latter." Jinya leaned over, arching an eyebrow. "You forgot the third option. It does nothing and we all sit here looking like idiots." "Always the realist," Cade replied, a smirk tugging at his lips despite the tension coiled in the room like a spring. He knew the stakes. If they could get a message to Earth, maybe, just maybe, they could get some help. Or at the very least, someone to vent their misery to. The rest of the group sat scattered around the cramped workshop, each one embodying varying degrees of skepticism. Talia seemed to be considering how quickly she could run away, while Grax looked like he was just there for the entertainment value. "All right, folks," Cade said, clapping his hands with mock enthusiasm. "Let's talk logistics. We're going to need Xylox for this one. And yes, I know trusting a Zorathian is like trusting a cat with your sandwich," Talia snorted, "or a teenager with your credit card." "Exactly," Cade agreed. "But we don't have much choice. We need his knowledge of their tech to make this work." Jinya crossed her arms, looking unconvinced. "And what happens if he decides to sell us out?" "We get a one-way ticket to Zorathian hospitality, and I hear they've upgraded from unpleasant to unbearable." Cade shrugged, an all-too-familiar sense of fatalism creeping into his tone. "Then at least we'll go down having tried something. Besides, I think Xylox's motivations are complicated. Like a calculus problem," Grax chimed in. "Or my love life. Let's hope he's on our side," Talia said, eyeing the door as if expecting Xylox to waltz in at any moment. "Because if he's not, we're about to get very well acquainted with the inside of a Zorathian cell." The tension in the room was palpable, heavy as a lead blanket, suffocating in its intensity. But then, what else was new? In a colony where the most reliable thing was the unreliability of life, a bit of tension was just part of the decor. Cade's stomach twisted itself into a knot of nerves and desperation. This plan was as risky as they came, but they needed a win, a glimmer of hope in the perpetual Martian night. "Let's get Xylox in on this," Cade said, determination coloring his voice. "If there's any chance of getting a message to Earth, we have to try." Finding Xylox wasn't difficult. He had a knack for showing up when least expected and most needed, like a particularly helpful ghost. He appeared in the doorway, looking every bit as inscrutable as ever, his alien features hard to read but somehow comforting in their familiarity. "Cade," he said, his voice a smooth, even tone that somehow managed to sound both reassuring and foreboding. "You needed me. We've got a plan," Cade replied, gesturing to the slapped-together communicator. "And we need your expertise to make sure it doesn't blow up in our faces, or worse, not work at all." Xylox tilted his head, his expression as close to amused as a Zorathian could probably get. "A wise precaution. Failure in these endeavors tends to be final." "Ah, well, no pressure then," Cade said, sarcasm dripping from his words like oil from a leaky engine. "Just our survival on the line." The room was silent as Xylox examined the device, his long fingers delicately prodding the components as if handling a live grenade. The rest of the group watched him with a mix of hope and trepidation, every eye in the room glued to the proceedings with the kind of intensity usually reserved for impending disasters. Finally, Xylox straightened, his verdict as nonchalant as if he were commenting on the weather. "It can work. Provided we have enough power and you're willing to take the risk." "Risk is what we do best," Jinya said, her voice wry as she leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. "Besides, what's life without a little danger?" "Shorter," Grax replied, deadpan as ever. Cade took a deep breath, the air thick with stale tension and a hint of newfound optimism. "All right, let's do this. Xylox, guide us through it." "We've got a message to send." The group got to work, every movement a frantic dance of desperation and determination. Wires were connected, switches flipped, with Cade's fingers moving on autopilot through the well-rehearsed chaos. It was a symphony of hope and madness, held together by stubbornness and a touch of insanity. "Any last-minute adjustments?" Talia asked, her fingers twitching with nervous energy. "Just keep your fingers crossed," Cade said, though he doubted any amount of wishful thinking could sway the odds in their favor. With everything in place, Cade turned to the group, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "This is it, folks. Moment of truth." The room fell silent, the weight of their combined hopes and fears pressing down like an oppressive Martian storm. They were gambling with everything they had, and the stakes had never been higher. Cade took a deep breath and flicked the switch, holding his breath as the device crackled to life, a low hum filling the room. For a moment nothing happened, and Cade's heart sank like a stone thrown into the void. Then slowly, a signal began to pulse, a rhythmic beat that was shockingly, blessedly, undeniably real. It was working. They were reaching out, sending their message into the vastness of space, a plea for help wrapped in defiance and desperation. "We're actually doing it," Jinya breathed, disbelief and awe coloring her words. "We're sending the message." Cade grinned, feeling a surge of triumph that threatened to overwhelm him. "Let's just hope someone's listening." Xylox monitored the device, his expression unreadable but his actions speaking volumes. He was committed, helping them navigate the intricacies of the Zorathian tech, ensuring their signal reached its destination without interference. The minutes ticked by, each one a small eternity as they waited, hoped, prayed for a response. And then the device pinged, a sharp, clear sound that sliced through the tension like a knife. "We've got a reply," Grax said, his voice thick with disbelief. "Someone heard us." "Now let's just hope it's the right someone," Talia murmured, her eyes wary despite the glimmer of hope in her gaze. Cade moved to the console, reading the transmission with an intensity born of desperation. The message was brief, just enough to tell them that someone on Earth had heard their call and was working to help. "We did it," Cade said, his voice cracking with emotion. "They heard us. We're not alone." A cheer went up from the group, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief and joy. For a moment they allowed themselves to revel in the victory, to feel that elusive spark of hope kindled anew. Xylox watched them, his eyes thoughtful. "This is but the beginning," he said, a hint of something almost like pride in his voice. "You must be prepared for what comes next. The Zorathians will not take this lightly." Cade nodded, sobering at the reminder of the challenges yet to come. "We'll be ready," he promised, determination hardening his tone. "We've come this far. We're not backing down now." The group dispersed, each member buzzing with the thrill of triumph and the knowledge of the fight that still lay ahead. For now they had hope and a chance to change their fate, two things they hadn't dared dream of just days before. As they left the workshop, Cade stayed behind, taking a moment to absorb the events of the day. It had worked. Against all odds they had sent their message and someone had answered. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but in their world it meant everything. Jinya was the last to leave, pausing by the door to look back at Cade. "You did good today, Cade," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "Yeah, well, we'll see how long that lasts," Cade replied, though he couldn't help but smile at her words. "Let's just hope this is the break we've been waiting for." Jinya nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Here's to hoping, and to more victories ahead." With that she left, leaving Cade alone in the dim light of the workshop. He sat down, the exhaustion of the day catching up with him now that the adrenaline had faded. But even as fatigue tugged at his bones, a sense of determination burned bright within him. They had done the impossible. They had reached out and someone had reached back. It was a start, a chance to fight back against the darkness that had threatened to swallow them whole. And as Cade sat there, surrounded by the remnants of their desperate gamble, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He thought of the journey ahead, the challenges yet to face, and the hope that now flickered in each of their hearts. In a world where even hope was a rare commodity, they had ignited a flame that could not be easily extinguished. And with that flame, they would light the way forward, step by step, until they had claimed their freedom once more. The Zorathian message-pinging machine hummed like a caffeinated wasp, a sound that was almost comforting amidst the chaos that had become their lives. Cade looked around the workshop, eyes scanning for any sign of malfunction or betrayal from the device that had somehow become their lifeline to Earth. It was still holding together, this cobbled mix of human stubbornness and alien tech, and that felt like a miracle worth noting. Grax peered over Cade's shoulder, his curiosity barely contained. "So what's the play now, fearless leader?" "We wait for Earth to come swooping in with capes and catchy theme music." Cade snorted, shaking his head. "Sure, and maybe they'll bring a marching band too. No, we play it smart. Earth's gotta work its magic from millions of miles away, and we've gotta make sure the Zorathians don't figure out we've been breaking their precious rules." "Right," Grax said, deadpan. Because our situation wasn't already a circus on fire. Talia leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her skepticism practically its own character in the room. Assuming Earth actually does something, how do we know it won't just make things worse? I mean, who's to say they won't just piss off the Zorathians even more? Cade shrugged. We don't. But I'm betting on the fact that Earth hates losing more than the Zorathians love being in charge. Besides, what's life without a little reckless optimism? Longer, Grax chimed in, a smirk playing at his lips. Xylox, who'd been watching the exchange with an expression that could be generously described as inscrutable, finally spoke up. The Zorathians won't remain ignorant for long. You'll need to disrupt their surveillance systems before any aid can arrive. Just like that, huh? Jinya asked, eyebrows raised. And here I thought we'd need a training montage first. Cade pointed to the schematics sprawled across a makeshift table, a mess of paper and holographic projections. Xylox, we're gonna need all the help you can give us. If we can knock out their monitoring, we buy ourselves time to figure out the rest. Xylox nodded, his alien features calm and composed, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the humans around him. I can disrupt the thought monitoring devices, but it will require precise coordination. Failure, as you humans say, is not an option. Failure's never an option, Grax quipped. But it often shows up uninvited. Cade shot him a look, though the corner of his mouth twitched upwards despite himself. All right, first things first, we need a distraction, something big enough to draw their attention away while we work on the disruptors. I vote for Grax's cooking, Jinya suggested, with a mock-serious expression. That stuff's a weapon of mass distraction. Hey, I didn't hear any complaints when you were scarfing down my last batch of Martian chili, Grax retorted. That's because my taste buds were too busy begging for mercy. Cade chuckled, the banter a brief respite from the grim reality of their plan. Save the culinary warfare for later. We've got to focus. Talia, you and Grax work on the distraction. Jinya, see if you can scrounge up anything useful from the storage. We need every edge we can get. They moved into action, a flurry of motion and determination. If they were going to pull this off, they'd need every ounce of ingenuity they had. The Zorathians had underestimated them once. They wouldn't get a second chance. Hours passed in a blur of activity. The workshop became a hub of organized chaos, wires and parts scattered like confetti after a particularly rowdy celebration. Xylox worked with a dexterity that was almost hypnotic, his alien hands moving with the precision of a well-tuned machine. Cade watched him, feeling a mix of gratitude and suspicion. Why help us, Xylox? What's in it for you? Xylox paused, his gaze meeting Cade's with an intensity that was almost unsettling. The Zorathians' control is built on fear and oppression. To challenge that is to claim one's dignity. It is a cause worth pursuing. Talia rolled her eyes, unable to resist the sarcasm. Ah, the old dignity motivator. Right up there with power and revenge. Whatever the reason, Cade said, his voice firm, we're glad to have you on our side. The plan, as it stood, was simple, though simple in their context meant somewhere between incredibly dangerous and probably suicidal. Grabbing a few final components, Cade gestured for the others to gather around. All right, here's the plan. Xylox and I will handle the disruptors. Talia and Grax, you create the distraction. Jinya, keep an eye out for any Zorathian nosing around where they shouldn't. Grax raised a hand. Can I make the distraction fire-related? No, Cade replied, exasperation tinging his voice. We've talked about your pyromania. Not pyromania, Grax corrected. It's strategic fire enthusiasm. Talia sighed, running a hand through her hair. Let's just make sure we don't end up as ash in the process, all right. With everything set, they split into their respective roles, each one a cog in the makeshift machine of their rebellion. The pressure was on, but so was a flicker of hope, a rare commodity that they couldn't afford to squander. The hours ticked by, each one feeling heavier than the last. As Cade and Xylox worked on the disruptors, the air filled with the scent of burnt circuits and the nervous energy of hastily concocted plans. It felt like preparing for a storm while already in the eye of one. Finally, the moment came. Grax and Talia had rigged up their distraction, something involving a cascade of sparks and sounds that resembled a dying star's last hurrah. Cade had to admit it was just the kind of loud, chaotic mess they needed. "All right, Grax, Talia, you're up," Cade said, feeling the tension coil in his chest like a living thing. "Make it count." Grax saluted, a mischievous grin plastered on his face. "Let's give them a show they'll never forget." They moved into position, and the plan unfolded with the kind of precision that suggested they might actually have a shot. The distraction went off like clockwork, noisily, brightly, and with enough spectacle to draw the attention of every Zorathian enforcer within range. Cade felt his heart hammering in his chest as he and Xylox initiated the disruptors. Their success relied on speed and stealth, two things that didn't always go hand in hand, but there was no turning back now. In the midst of chaos, Xylox remained calm, fingers dancing over the device's controls. "It is done," he announced, the alien's voice steady and sure. "The disruptors are active." The relief hit Cade like a tidal wave, though he knew better than to celebrate prematurely. They still had to make it out without getting caught, a feat that felt increasingly impossible as the Zorathians began to converge on their location. "Time to disappear," Cade said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone, meet at the safe point." They scattered, each person slipping into the shadows that had become their allies in this fight. The Zorathians were closing in, their grim-faced enforcers swarming like ants on a disturbed nest. Cade's heart thundered in his ears as he ducked into a narrow corridor, feet moving on autopilot. He could hear the heavy steps of the enforcers behind him, the metallic clink of their armor a chilling reminder of what failure would mean. But failure wasn't an option. Not now, not ever. They regrouped at the safe point, a small alcove hidden from view. Breathless and wired with adrenaline, they stared at each other in a mix of disbelief and triumph. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd managed to pull the rug out from under the Zorathians. For now, at least, they had their freedom back. Freedom to speak, to think, to scheme without the constant threat of being overheard. It was a victory, however small, in a war that was far from over. Jinya looked at Cade, a smile twitching at the corners of her mouth. "Well, that wasn't completely disastrous." Cade grinned, exhaustion and triumph battling for supremacy in his expression. "Here's to not being dead yet." They laughed, a sound of camaraderie and shared relief, though the shadow of what lay ahead still loomed over them. Xylox watched the humans, his expression softening with something akin to admiration. "You have done well," he said, his voice carrying a weight that demanded respect. "The Zorathians may not have expected this, but they will certainly retaliate." Grax shrugged, his grin undiminished. "Let him try. The human spirit isn't so easily squashed." They knew it was just the beginning, that the road ahead was long and fraught with danger. But for the first time in a long time, they had hope. And sometimes, hope was all you needed to keep going. Cade looked at his ragtag group, unlikely allies bound together by circumstance and necessity. They were bruised, battered, but not broken. They'd taken the first step on a path that could lead them home, and that was more than they dared dream of when all this began. "Let's get some rest," Cade suggested, exhaustion finally catching up. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us." As they settled into the cramped safety of their hideout, the sense of victory lingered, a bright spark in the darkness. They had defied the odds, sent a message to Earth, and reclaimed a piece of their dignity. In the grim reality of a colonized Mars, that was no small feat. And no matter what came next, they would face it together, with sarcasm, courage, and just the right amount of reckless abandon to keep things interesting. After the dust settled, quite literally, and the adrenaline ebbed away, the underground colony on Mars began to feel like a new place. It was a feeling akin to waking up with a hangover and realizing you actually remembered the night before. The Zorathians were still a looming threat, but at least for now, Their thought-monitoring devices were as effective as a paper umbrella in a meteor storm. Arlen Vex, the previously detained former leader, was released back to the colony. His return was met with cheers and a celebration that bordered on riotous, considering the Martian standards of a good time generally involved rationed beverages and recycled air. The man's charisma was intact, along with a few bruises that added a roguish charm to his grin. Cade watched as Arlen took the makeshift stage, his voice booming with the kind of practiced nonchalance that made him a natural leader. "Well, it seems the Zorathians couldn't handle this much Martian charisma," he quipped, earning a round of laughter from the gathered crowd. "Or maybe they just couldn't stand the smell," Grax, standing beside Cade, chuckled. "Probably both. I heard the Zorathians have a particularly sensitive olfactory system. Maybe we should start bottling our collective aroma as a weapon," Cade snorted. "Yeah, eau de Martian sewer. Guaranteed to clear a room or your money back." As the laughter settled, Arlen continued, his tone shifting from jovial to sincere. "But seriously, folks, we owe this moment to Cade and his band of misfits." He gestured grandly toward Cade, who felt his face flush despite himself. "Their plan, their execution, it was nothing short of legendary." "Or suicidal," Jinya interjected, never one to let a compliment land unchallenged. "You know, potato, potato." A wave of applause followed, echoing off the steel walls in a way that made the space feel alive. It was a sound they hadn't heard in a long time, a reminder that they were more than just survivors, they were a community. Cade took a deep breath, stepping up beside Arlen. "We did what we had to. This was never about heroics. It was about giving us all a chance to breathe freely, to be ourselves without someone looking over our shoulder. Or into our heads," Talia added, her arms crossed as she leaned against a nearby bulkhead. "Because let's face it, if they really wanted to see what goes on in there, they'd have run for the hills ages ago." "Or Mars' equivalent of hills," Grax noted. "Ever seen a Martian hill? It's like a zit on a teenager." The laughter was a balm, easing the tension that had hung over them like a cloud of bad cologne. For the first time in ages, they weren't just fighting to survive, they were living. Xylox, who had been quietly observing the human interaction with an expression of mild amusement, finally spoke. "Your resilience is commendable. A quality my people could learn from." "Yeah, well, we humans have a knack for stubbornly refusing to accept reality," Cade replied, a smile tugging at his mouth. "It's a survival skill," and sarcasm, Grax added. "We'd probably be extinct without it. Or at least a lot duller," Jinya said with a wink. As the impromptu celebration continued, the air filled with stories and laughter. The Zorathian threat, while not eradicated, felt manageable. It was amazing what a little rebellious spirit could do for morale. Later, as the festivities wound down and the colony settled into a more subdued buzz of conversation, Cade found himself reflecting on their unlikely alliance. He approached Xylox, who was staring thoughtfully at a holographic display of Earth, an image that seemed a world away in more ways than one. "Thanks for your help back there," Cade said, leaning against the cold metal wall. "I know you didn't have to get involved." Xylox turned, his alien features unreadable but somehow softer. "The Zorathians are not all of one mind. There are those who disagree with their methods." "Well, you've definitely earned yourself an honorary Martian citizen title," Cade joked. "Assuming that's something you'd want." Xylox inclined his head, a gesture that seemed both alien and familiar at once. "It would be an honor. Your people have a spirit that is refreshing," Cade chuckled. "That's one way to put it. I like to think of it as organized chaos on a good day." "Chaos can be a catalyst for change," Xylox replied, his voice carrying a wisdom that seemed ageless. "And change is often necessary." "Let's just hope we're changing things for the better," Cade mused, glancing around at the colony that had become his home in more ways than he'd realized. Arlen joined them, a drink in hand and a satisfied smile playing on his lips. "You know, Cade, for someone who claims not to be a leader, you sure have a knack for it." Just lucky, I guess, Cade responded, though he knew luck had very little to do with it. It was more about desperation and necessity, the real parents of invention. You know what they say, Arlen continued, raising his glass in a mock toast. Never let a good crisis go to waste. I think that sums up our entire existence here, doesn't it? Grax said, joining the group with a lopsided grin. Tomorrow's problems can wait until tomorrow, or until the next Zorathian compliance check, Talia quipped. Whichever comes first. The night wore on, filled with the kind of camaraderie that only shared hardship could forge. They were a motley crew, a hodgepodge of personalities and quirks, but they were family. And family, as it turned out, was a force to be reckoned with. As the last of the revelers drifted away, Cade found himself alone with his thoughts. The challenges ahead were daunting, but for the first time they felt like challenges that could be met head-on rather than lurking threats in the shadows. He glanced over at Xylox, who was still studying the holographic image of Earth. Kind of makes you wonder what the folks back home are doing, huh? Xylox nodded, his gaze never leaving the projection. Perhaps they are wondering about the stars and the people among them. Or maybe they're just watching reality TV and eating junk food, Cade suggested, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Xylox chuckled, a sound that was surprisingly human for such an alien being. Both are plausible. As the colony slipped into a quiet lull, Cade felt a flicker of hope, a small, persistent flame that refused to be snuffed out. They had reclaimed a piece of their dignity, and for now, that was enough. The future would bring new battles, new challenges, but they would face them together, with sarcasm, grit, and an unyielding determination that even the Zorathians couldn't crush. And that, in the end, was the real victory. For now, they would rest. For now, they would hope. And for now, that was more than enough.